All right. Welcome to Bible Talk. We're glad to have you with us tonight. And I have a couple of fellows here with me tonight. You may have seen them in times past. Here I have Pastor Ben to my right, and of course my son right across from the table, Silas. He's been with us a few times, and will be with us a few times more as we incorporate things together that way. I know we don't normally like having our kids do things with us like that. We want to have control, but, Silas is here and we get along pretty good, don't we, anyway? Especially since you got saved, then it's really good. But in the midst of our night tonight, I did have some other plans, but they got in the way, got canceled a little bit, so I decided tonight that I would simply just give my testimony. I know that throughout the time I've been thinking about that, how to work that in, and now that I have Silas and we brought along Ben, and so we're going to talk about that here tonight. And of course, I'm just jabbering for a minute to help let you get online. And I don't know if one of you guys have your phone with you, do you? We want to just check the volume, make sure our volume's on. And so we're not going to be able to do any questions tonight. But if you do have any questions concerning what we do talk about tonight, you can always message me afterwards. We are going to, and we got the sound check, all right, thank you. We are going to talk about testimony here tonight, but then after I give my testimony, we're going to talk a little bit about fellowship and how important that is. And as we do that, we'll understand why that's so important and how it is important even for ourselves. But for right now, I'm going to turn away from the camera and just going to talk to these two fellas, and hopefully you'll have some better understanding about Christ and salvation and even fellowship by the end of our time here tonight. So we welcome you tonight, and we'll talk to you afterwards here. So, guys, what a blessing it is to be around both of you tonight. I think of all the guys that I would be liking to sit at this table with me, it'd be both of you. And of course, as I think about that, Silas, you and I, we've kind of got along here together with some of these programs, and it's starting to work out pretty well. But what do you think about, really both of you, but what do you think about the testimonies, just testimony in general? We've gone through some of the testimonies, and in fact, Pastor Ben, let me ask you first. What do you think about just the idea of giving testimony? You've heard some of the testimonies on these nights, and what do you think about just the idea of giving testimony of what we're actually doing?
I think it's great. I love hearing testimonies. When I think of testimonies in particular, I think what I enjoy so much about them is you go into God's Word and it tells you a lot about who God is and what He's like and all the things that He can do and just so much. And then when you hear somebody's testimony, it's like you see God actually working and changing somebody's life and just all that He does in that. So it's like all the truth that we understand in our mind really comes to life. And so anytime you can sit there and hear just about all the truth of God's work out in somebody's life, it's like, that's awesome. It's just...
Have you ever, in all the times you've heard testimonies, have you ever heard two that are the same?
No. There's similar types, but no, not in a lot of ways. Similar principles, but different people. And
I think about you and your family, and you have a lot of kids in your family, and many of them saved, but none of them have the same testimony.
No.
Even as close as they are, in that way.
Right, yeah.
So, Silas, what are your thoughts on just the idea of giving testimony? You've been a part of this now for a few weeks, especially, and you've heard a lot of them. And, of course, you've given your testimony on the program, too. I was going back and I was listening to that here a while ago. What are your thoughts on just the idea of testimonies?
Well, I've really enjoyed hearing them on here. It's different here than it has been most other places I think I've heard them. And I think maybe it's just because I'm sitting here and listening to everybody, and they're all different, but it's like there's an anticipation to the climax of they reached a place of where they didn't know, and the Lord was there reaching out His hand, and they took it. And I like hearing that. So, as far as it's here, I enjoy it very much.
And there is a difference in hearing just a person just kind of on their own, just give a 5 or 10 minute testimony,
Right.
as opposed to right here. What do you see as the difference? I've got in my mind a few things, Pastor Ben too. What are some of the differences in this setting as opposed to just a regular setting where somebody's standing up speaking even their testimony?
Well, maybe some of it's you know the person personally and you don't have to give as much detail. So maybe here you're giving much more detail, so the story comes to life versus I'm just kind of giving you bullet points to it. And yeah.
Right. And of course, the interview type style enables you just to get in a little bit deeper on some of these areas in that way.
Right.
So, but all right. Well, tonight I'm going to give my testimony, and you guys can, of course, you're the moderator, so for the first half of this program anyway. Sure. So you feel free to jump in any time. And Pastor Ben, I appreciate your being here too tonight. And more than what you know, you're a part of my testimony and my life and so forth. And of course, even now, it's kind of weird calling you my pastor, but it's getting less weird. Especially when I'm praying and I say, now Lord, would you please bless Pastor Ben and let him know, that we care for him and that we love him and all that. And I'm kind of pouring it on a little thick for you now, aren't I? I'm trying to get some brownie points here. So
doesn't work that way.
Well, how about we just get started with you then? All right. Right.
So. Well, it's interesting because part of my testimony as well is you sitting here. You're one of the 7 children that we've had, and in fact, the other day I told your mom somebody was asking how many children we had, and I said, yeah, I said we had 6, and I'm like,
you forgot about me.
And well, you're in the middle, so I couldn't forget about you, but I missed the numbers. So anyway, it was kind of funny, but I think I was thinking about maybe my testimony because I grew up with 6 kids. Or 6 siblings, including myself, and so my testimony goes back to the East Coast, back to Newport, Rhode Island. There I grew up. There I was born and raised in that way, probably for about 12 years. But it was during that time that I began to really consider and think about spiritual things. And in fact, I don't remember how old I was, but it was somewhere 4 or 5 years old. I remember there was somebody across the street that they were part of this organization. It was Oral Roberts or something like that. It was one of these charismatic type places or events. Anyway, they were. In fact, I remember after I got saved, I remembered a verse that they had given me, which was, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And that was that ministry's verse. And I'd always thought about that verse. And of course, it came to life after I got saved. But I remember at one point going across the street, and there in the afternoons, they had some sort of a home Bible kids program. And we'd go over there every day for about a week, and they would just teach us the Bible, and they would open it up and bring things out. I don't remember anything I taught, but I remember they were teaching the Bible, and of course this whole other program that they had going on. But nonetheless, I remembered that, and so really the gospel. I don't even know if the gospel was presented, but I know the word was presented. So it just piqued my interest a little bit at that time.
How old did you say you were?
I was probably 5 or 6 years old at the time.
So did your parents know that you were going to this?
Yeah, I was right across the street. Oh. So yeah, they probably looked, and they probably didn't care anyway. It was back in the days when the murderers went around, and all that. And besides, I wasn't the nicest kid on the block either. So
you had a reputation at 6 years old.
We had a little bit of a reputation of things. But maybe I'll get into that a little later. It just got worse. That's all. As I think about that particular time, thinking about hearing some word that just got me interested in that way. Well, then my parents, they got involved with this Oral Roberts ministry, and so they had we'd watch them on Sunday mornings. We'd watch him preach and all of that, and my parents, they would take us to church. I still remember going to church one Easter, and my mom made me dress up in a green polka dotted yellow suit. It scarred me for years. And but I remember going to church, you know, and just hearing things that way, and then an event took place. In my home, that things were just kind of goofy. My mom was on a second marriage, were just all kinds of things happening that way, and the next thing I knew, my dad was in the hospital. He had been in the hospital because he went on top of the Newport Bridge, which ironically is called the New Hope Bridge. And he went up on the middle of this bridge, a 200-foot drop, and he went out on the ledge and he was going to take his life. And at that point, something happened with him. I don't know what happened. I'd have to go back and kind of read through some different things, because what did happen was he came down off the bridge, and the next thing I know, he wound up in the middle of this Oral Roberts magazine. And so it had a 2-page layout of some spiritual experience that he had, whereby he got down off this bridge. And so from that point on, it was like there was more kind of a spiritual thing going on in our home. But it didn't really make any difference to me. All I knew is that there was some spiritual thing that way. Later on, his spiritual walk was just no different than anybody else's walk and whatnot. He didn't have a walk. He really didn't.
So that didn't affect you at all as far as seeking the Lord?
It didn't really affect me because, other than the fact I do remember having a picture of Oral Roberts in my bedroom. It was like, okay, well, I guess that's what I do. But it didn't really affect me. It is interesting to note that my dad, he did get saved 6 months before he passed away, and so that experience was real. Whereas the other, I don't know what was that, but anyway, he not only did he have the spiritual experience, but he was also heavy into alcohol and just, you know, things of that nature. And so that had an effect upon me in my life, even though I never touched alcohol. But I did touch a few other things. As I was growing up, there were two things that really when the time came where the Lord was working in my life unto salvation, these two things, they really took a forefront in my mind. And one of them was when I was, I was probably, I want to say 7 or 8 years old. I would go down to the local stores and I would just steal anything. Anything. And it was just
Did you need to steal it, or you just wanted
we did not need to, except for Christmas time, you know. But it was a horrible thing. It was a terrible thing. But there was something that was just real for me. It was in my life. We did a lot of horrible things that way. And I say we because I wasn't alone in all of it. Yeah, right. And then the other thing was, when I was young, I was probably, I want to say 10 or 11, somewhere right in there. It's really interesting. Somebody gave me a cigarette to smoke. I smoked a half of that and got sick off it. Never smoked again. Somebody gave me a drink of beer, and I took a drink of that. Couldn't stand it. Never drank again. But somewhere along the line, I can't remember who it was, they had one of these lewd magazines. And I remember going and looking at the pictures in that magazine, and it captured me. And so that was I wouldn't say it was a huge part of my life at the time, but it was something that was big, just like stealing was big. It was kind of the thing that we did. And of course, those two things, they had a profound effect upon me recognizing myself as a sinner. And so, along this time, my grandfather was sick with diabetes, and he lived in Wisconsin. And so my family picked up, drew us out of the whole roots of everything, brought us right into a little place in Wisconsin. I felt like the Wizard of Oz, where I didn't know anybody or anything, and I was waiting for the lions and tigers and bears to come jumping out. So I was about 13 years old, plunked into this new place, and started a new school, started new friends, everything that way. During this time, of course, church was not a thing. It hadn't been for a long time. My parents ended up divorcing, and so now I'm there with my mom and a couple of siblings and so forth. In all of this, I still thought about the Lord. In fact, one of the things that always that I held a little bit of, I was profound by it, was when we moved out here. I had a toolbox that had a special place in my heart, and it got lost during the trip. And so I remember specifically praying that God would find that toolbox and bring it to me. And the day that toolbox arrived, I remember my confidence in knowing that God was real was just a profound thing. Now, whether he answered it or not, because
did you ask for a really nice car afterwards?
I did not. I didn't ask for a whole lot afterwards either. But it was just like, hey, God is real. He answered this prayer. At least that's what I thought. Now I know that we understand the scripture to say, hey, the Lord doesn't answer the prayer of an unrighteous man. But I looked at it as the Lord was having mercy on me. Mm-hmm. And so in the midst of that, I started seeking a little bit more during that time. And then, of course, my parents were divorced. And while I was in high school, or actually it was not high school, but junior high, I had two things in my mind. I had stealing on my mind, and I had girls on my mind. And so I was still taking things, but and so not as much, but I was still, and then I was still interested in girls way earlier than what I should have been. And so in the course of things, I began to get around some different people in school that were Christians. And now I thought I was a Christian because every Sunday that I would go to church, the pastor, he would get up and he would say, "Dear Christian friends." And he was looking right at me. And I'm like, he's talking to me. And when I was 12 years old, my parents brought me in and baptized me, sprinkled me. And of course, at this time, I just thought, hey, I'm a Christian. And so...
Did you ever doubt that or question that you were a Christian?
I never questioned it.
So, like, when you were doing things that weren't good and were wrong, what did you think of them?
I was just thinking, hey, I'm not a good Christian.
But you knew they were wrong.
I knew they were wrong.
But still, you're a Christian.
Yep. Okay. And again, that was, when I went to church, it was like, it was just as if I was saying right to you, Ben, you're a Christian. And that's the way I took it. Because I had been baptized, I'd gone through whatever needed to be done, and so I was a Christian. And so I got around these Christian friends, but they knew the Lord. And so one of them was my friend Dave. Now, I was about I suppose I was about 14 at this time. And I remember going into the Coast to Coast store. It's no longer in Durand. Otherwise, I would return everything that I ever stole from them. But I went into the store, and I remember there was a fishing lure there. And for whatever reason, I didn't even know how to fish, but for whatever reason, I took this fishing lure and I pocketed it. And as soon as I did, my friend Dave saw me. And he gave me this stern look, and he fled the store. He left me there just holding the bag. And of course, I went away with it, but he was so upset with me and so angry with me, he didn't talk to me for weeks. And eventually when he did talk to me again, I don't remember that we even ever talked about that, but I know that was the last time that I ever went into a store and stole anything. And because I wanted his friendship. And so anyway, after that time, then we started getting around some different friends. I started going to church again. And at this time then, I started dating a girl. And she was a Christian. Now, she had no business dating me whatsoever.
I was going to say, did she know you weren't a Christian?
I believe that she knew that I wasn't, but maybe she had some doubts. I probably should ask her. She may be even listening to the program. And but at that time, I just assumed that I was a Christian. But I went one summer day in June of 1979. I was in her home, and her dad was in the kitchen, and I was in the kitchen, and he came over to me, and he said, Steve, he said, are you a Christian? And I looked at him and I said, well, of course I am. And I said it just like that.
And then you stole a cookie from the cookie jar?
Right. And that was all he ever said. But I knew when he asked me that question, I knew he didn't believe that I was a Christian. And I also knew that what he was asking me was far different than what anyone else had ever asked me before.
How did that affect you? Did it make you angry? Or?
No, it didn't make me angry. What it did was it really made me search. Because when I left there, I knew that he was asking me about something that I did not know anything about. I knew that when he was asking me what a Christian was, it wasn't like the other Christians that I had come about and talked with or gone to church with and so forth.
What was different about it?
There was something different about him, his demeanor, and of course her demeanor, and now it was like something, and maybe at the time, and I don't remember it full well, but it may have been that I really heard what was going on, particularly in their lives, that was different, and I didn't really know it until he asked me that question.
Right.
And so I began from that time in June. I just began thinking about where I was at. I began thinking about my relationship with the Lord. I began asking myself, am I really a Christian? Do I even know what a Christian is? And I don't remember specifically anybody really ever sharing the gospel with me, but I do know that this girlfriend at the time, I do know that she had shared the gospel with me, that there were some others that had talked to me about some of those things. We had gone to some some kids meetings together, teenage group things, and I know the gospel was presented there, but I don't remember any of that. But for the next month, I began thinking about my sin, and it was like sin came full force. My stealing ways, my ways with thinking about girls in that respect, and then also my mouth just would not stop. One fellow said he cursed so much he could curse the wallpaper off a wall. And I wasn't that bad, but my mouth was just dirty. It was filthy. And so I thought about all these things. So one night in July, all these things were coming, and what happened was over the course of that month, it produced an emptiness in my mind, in my heart. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that I felt there was something missing out of my life. And I went to my girlfriend's place that one night in July, and I don't remember anything about that night. We used to play a lot of ping pong and stuff like that, and I don't remember much about that night, but I do remember going home. And I went home, and it was probably about 11 o'clock. And at this time, I was 15 years old. So I go out of her place at 11 o'clock, and I don't know, maybe she even witnessed to me that night. I don't really know. But I went out of there that night, and across her house was an old stone wall. It was like 2 feet high. And I remember going out there, and I was just so burdened that I sat down next to on that wall. And I remember at that point, it was a clear night in July, and I looked up into the sky, and I saw thousands of stars. And I thought, Lord, you are so big, you are so holy, you are so mighty. Why would you even have interest in me? I'm just a speck. I am nothing. And I began to pour my heart out to the Lord, just my own sin, my own worthiness. I didn't know how to change myself. I didn't know how to do anything. And I like to say it was in my stupidity that I called upon the Lord, because I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody had ever told me, hey, pray a sinner's prayer, or do, whatever. They didn't tell me how to come to the Lord. But that night, I called on the Lord, and what I remember was that I called out and I said, Lord, I can't fix myself. I can't get rid of my sin. You have to do it. You have to do in me what I can't do for myself. And so I spent time just crying unto the Lord and really just pleading with him that he would come to change my life, to do what he would do. And again, I say in my stupidity, because really what I was doing was asking the Lord to save me.
But you didn't know that.
I did not know. I didn't know the language. I didn't know any of that.
So that was just you. That was just naturally what you were doing. It's not like in your mind you were going, I'm committing my life to the Lord.
No.
In your mind you were just communing with him.
Right. It was really the first time that I ever communed with God in that way, other than praying for my toolbox. But I trusted him with my toolbox, and now I was trusting him with my life. And so I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I didn't get up and say, okay, now I'm saved. I didn't know what that even was. So the next day, I went home, and I slept, got up the next morning, and I remember waking up the next morning, and I'm like, where is my Bible? And I went and I grabbed my Bible, and I just started reading. And as I began to read, I'm just like, the Word of God was just, it was open. It was like milk. I was just drinking it. And then I began to pray. And I was like praying to God as my Father. And I just remember that thinking going on. It was just like, He's my Father. His Word is open. I just remember that it was just like the light got switched on, but I didn't know what was going on.
So what did you think was happening?
I didn't know. I really didn't. And so I went back to my girlfriend's place that next day. And I remember talking with her, and I'm like, look, I don't know what happened. And I told her the story that I just told you. And I'll never forget her words. She said to me, happy birthday, you've been born again. And I said, I don't know what that is or what it means, but I'm glad I got it. and so the Lord really began to work in my. In fact, I remember the next day. It was like I had absolutely, before any of this, before I knew what really went on, I remember I had absolutely no desire to use profanity. It was just clean gone. It was not a part of my vocabulary from that point on. And so anyway, when that happened, then of course I started getting in the Word of God. I began to soak it up. I began to read it, began to just meditate and pray, and I was going to church. In fact, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anybody to guide me. And so I went back to the church that I was going to. And I went back there, and it was just a mainline church. And I went back, and I went to church that next Sunday, and I told everybody what happened. And a couple of ladies, they didn't know what to say. So they went out and they bought me Bibles. So I got more Bibles the next couple of weeks than I ever had. And because they just, now one of the gals, she did know the Lord. And so I appreciated her influence in my life at that point. In fact, I've seen her influence in other people's lives too. But nonetheless, I did that, and I was just like, so I got the Bible, I started reading, and I'm just like, well, I got to do more. I don't know what to do. And so I just started reading more, and I went to the pastor, and I'm like, what do I do? And he's like, well, you need to go through confirmation. I'm like, okay, well, let's do it. And he's like, well, we don't do that for another 6 months. And I'm like, well, I need to do it now. He's like, well, okay. So I went through a crash course of confirmation for 6 weeks. And I was the only person that was ever confirmed on Palm Sunday in that church. So I got confirmed, and I'm like, I got to do more. What more is there? And so we had a group of teenagers at the high school that were Christians. And so I went to the pastor, and I said, look, we need to have a young people's Bible study. I said, I've got the group. I said, when can you meet?
So you just started creating things to happen because you didn't know what.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do, so I was just doing what what came natural.
I suppose.
And again, and this is part of the reason why fellowship is so important, which we'll talk about afterwards. I should take my watch off, make sure, I am prone to talk more, and you guys do know about this. So, so anyway, I had this group of people. I went to this pastor, and I said, we need to meet. So, what night can you do a Bible study for us? And he said, well, what night do you have in mind? I said, well, how about Monday? He's like, well, I have golf that night. I'm like, okay. How about Tuesday? Well, Tuesday and Thursday is girls basketball, so that won't work out. And Wednesday was church or confirmation or whatever. Friday, he was off with anyway, nothing worked out. And my heart just dropped. And what had happened during this time was the Lord was really working in my life about becoming a pastor. And I didn't even know what that really meant, other than that I just wanted to do whatever God wanted me to do that way. But when I saw him and his spirit towards just the gospel, towards the Bible, towards just spiritual things, I thought to myself, and I remember the day I said, if that's what a pastor is, I don't want to be one. And so I just gave up that thought. But I kept pressing on, and we had a lot of Bible studies. A lot of we got all the young people together. We had another pastor from another church that was a gospel preaching church, and he played a big role in those days. We'd get together and we'd have some activity, and he would preach the gospel to us all. And then at one point, I remember we went to a particular church, and I'm not sure how it all happened, but I was the one that was preaching. And so anyway, the Lord still had a plan to accomplish what he wanted in the midst of it all.
So that pastor he just turned you off to that direction as a pastor? Why was that? You said it was his spirit, but was he just not focused on the gospel, or was
it was a profession to him,
Sure.
and I didn't want a profession. I wanted a calling. That's what I was looking at. When I look back on it, that's what was going on, and it was cold to me, and that's not what I envisioned. I didn't even know what a pastor was, but it wasn't that.
Right.
So at any rate, at that point, then, of course, now I'm 15, so I'm in the first year of high school, and so I go into high school that particular year as a believer, and so I had a lot of. You had a lot of
friends, didn't you?
I had a lot of friends, and I had a lot of wrongs to right. I do remember a particular gal that I went to after I got saved, and I remember I can still see this today. I went to her, and she was a nice gal, and she still is today. And I told her, I said, look, I said, I want you to know, I said, I apologize for everything I ever said, thought, and even did to you in light of just a woman. Mm-hmm. And because I hadn't treated her right and so forth. And I remember her response, she was like, what do you mean? Everything's all good? And I'm like, no, it wasn't, honey. What I did, what I thought, it was not right. And so
she just thought it was normal.
Yeah, she just thought it was normal. And but what was abnormal was me apologizing.
Right. So it maybe made her feel uncomfortable, even apologizing.
Right.
Isn't it crazy how that works? If you apologize to somebody for something you did, it's like they have to acknowledge that they were wrong as well, so they kind of push it off.
Right.
Which is, it's kind of cool how the gospel works that way.
It is that way, and it's difficult to go and to make restoration when we think about it, just to apologize for who you are and what you've been, what we've done. But that's a part of a Christian life.
Right. And it's a testimony, and it draws people to the Lord in the right circumstance, the right way.
So I had a lot of that going on, a lot of apologies that way.
So you're giving the gospel through apologies.
Right. And I remember I had stolen a book in the library, and I had to, and I didn't know what to do. It's like, what do I do now? So, because I didn't know, and in fact, this was many years later that I had thought about taking this book from the library. And so I looked up the old librarian, and I went back and I gave him money for the book. Told him why I was giving it to him, gave him the gospel, anyway. So, but it was during high school that things got rough. When I say rough, I mean, even though I had a few Christian friends, by and large, nobody had honor for the gospel. And so I would carry my Bible to school, and sometimes I would just carry it because I just wanted to carry it. Other times I would carry it because I wanted to read it or whatever. And but I was constantly being made fun of because I was carrying the Bible and reading and so forth. And
was that discouraging or encouraging?
It was I would say a little of both. I remember one time that I'm walking down the hallways of the school, and everybody's they kind of got their back up against the wall. They're sitting there and their legs are spread out. So there's only a small room to go through, and I'd be going through, and they'd be, "Amen, brother, amen, hallelujah," and I'm just like, whatever, and I'd keep on going. But I do remember there was one time that I lost my cool, and I of course I had to apologize for that afterwards, but they were just mocking, and so just discouraging so much, and I just couldn't understand it, because what I had was something that was good and was real and that was true. And I remember I yelled at one of the guys, but then after I did that, it was like it got out of my system. It was like, okay, no more of that nonsense.
And you get made fun of as much after that?
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but it just didn't bother me. I remember bringing my Bible into study hall. Of course, I had it with me everywhere, and they were like, they were at this. This was a point at which everybody was like, you can't preach, you can't do any of that stuff in the schools and whatnot. But I carried my Bible, and I'm like, okay, well, I can't preach, but I remember in study hall, I'd be reading a passage, and I'm like, yeah, I need to do that. So I called the teacher over, and I'm like, can you explain what this means? And I'd have them read the Bible and explain what they thought it meant, and just go on. It's just, I mean, you know, it was just one of those things, you know, that I thought was that I could do, you know, just to do that. But in the midst of all of that, God was at work and drew me. And of course, it was during that time in high school that I actually met your mom.
Was she a believer at the time?
She was not. And I suppose that was kind of, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of good background in me anyway. And so by the time I met your mom, I was just like, okay, she's a decent girl. She's from down south. She's got all the right morals and everything else. And so we started dating. That's kind of a story in itself that I won't repeat here. But we started dating, and we had dated for about 6 months, and then she was at a Christmas program and had gotten saved at that time. So she had a lot of Bible background, of course, and you know, things that way. So, but in all of it, the Lord just really began to mold me and make me in the man that I needed to be, especially during those high school years. In fact, there were many times during that high school that I had opportunity, and I would just take every opportunity that I could. During speech class, I would just preach sermons and messages, and of course I didn't know what I was doing, but I would try it anyway. And I remember sitting next to one of the fellows, and he said, "Steve," he said, "I'd become a Christian, but he says I really like to have fun." And he had as much of a bad concept of Christianity as what I did when I was growing up. You know, he just thought everybody that was a Christian was sober and quiet and didn't do anything that was purposeful and enjoying in life. And that was kind of a philosophy that was kind of running around in the school even at the time.
So your believing friends, did they kind of separate themselves from you as well, or did you guys grow closer together?
We actually grew closer together because we had a lot of these youth groups that we were doing together. We actually formed a group, a singing group together called the King's Kids, and we would go out and we'd go to different churches, and everybody would sing and I would preach.
What was the name of that?
King's Kids. Yeah. And so we
you
had
guys have an album or anything?
no albums. That was spoiled when I joined the group. But it was good. Well, it was during that time actually when I was, I want to say it was about, I was 16, maybe 16 and a half. So maybe say for a year and a half or two. We lived in Durand, and it was at that time that there was a knock on my door. We lived in apartment housing, and so there was a knock on my door, and it was your dad. And so you know he's there, and I'm like, what do you want? You know. And anyway, so he introduced himself, and we got to. In fact, I remember going down to the church. Now you know what? Maybe I got this story backwards. So scratch what I just said, because it was the Jehovah's Witness that came to my door. That's why that's what was in my mind. But what happened was I started thinking, because I was growing disgruntled with the church that I was in because there was just nothing there for me. I do remember listening to a message there one Sunday, and I went to another church of the same denomination a week later, and I heard the same message. And I'm like, something ain't right here. And so I looked in the newspaper, and here was an article in there from your dad about them meeting downtown at the community center. And so I thought, well, this kind of sounds interesting. And so I went down there, and of course I'm just a young kid. I didn't know anything about morals, anything about any of that, other than what Christ was already working in my life. And so so anyway, I went down to the church building, or down to where they were meeting. I met your dad for the first time, and it was at that time that he didn't let go. Then he came back, and then he knocks on my door, and so I went there with him went to church there for I don't know, probably a month or two, and it was just way different than what I was used to. The preaching was hard. Everything was just way. It was like, there's no collars on the pastor. There's no robes. There's no choir. There's no nothing like that. It's just like, this is just way too weird for me. And so I left. And I didn't go back for a number of months. And I can't remember what it was that drew me back. But during this time, I was with all these different people, and we were talking, all these other Christians, we were talking about gospel things and so forth, and I think that just drew me more, especially when I went to the counselor at the high school. I had to laugh at this, but I went to the counselor at high school. They went through a job search, and so they ask you 400 questions about everything and anything about what would you do as a job, and mine came up as clergy. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And so anyway, I started going back to the church. Well, it was at this time they actually had formed as a church, and so that was in 1981, I believe that they started as a church in that like April or something of 81, and so I started going all the time, even though I was the youngest guy there.
How old were you? 18?
Nope, I was 16 and a half at the time. Yep. And or 17, right in there. And but I do remember there wasn't there other than the little kids that were around. I was the only teenager. The next oldest person there was your dad. And so I kind of felt out of place, but at the same time, I felt right at home because now the Word of God was really beginning to speak to me in a way that I wanted answers. And so we started being there, meeting with him, and so he became a close friend at that point. And it was just a couple of months later that I was really challenged with just coming out for the Lord, just getting baptized, and just joining in with the church and being a part. And so I did that. And of course, all of those events just catapulted everything in that way. And so anyway, from that point on, things began. I got married, had a bunch of kids. Of course.
So when you got saved and you went to these churches, none of them told you should be baptized?
No, the only time I ever heard about baptism was when Pastor Stanley had talked to me about it.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. Other than, of course, I was sprinkled as a kid, but
Right.
that wasn't baptism, didn't mean anything.
Right.
At that point.
I mean, all the churches are following God's word, and not one of them was like, the first thing you should do is get baptized.
Right after you get saved, yeah,
Right.
I definitely didn't know about that. So,
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it is because the churches they're more about, okay, we got young people, let's just do what we do with young
Right.
people, not so much discipling or encouraging them to go on the
Right.
Lord.
The same reason that turned flock to the churches.
Right. So and of course afterwards, the Lord worked it out where I began mentoring under your dad, mentored under him for about 4 years, and then pastored alongside your dad for 6 months, and then he came here and started this church, and I went on having more babies and pastoring there for a number of years, and of course now. This is why it's kind of ironic for me to, for you to be my pastor. It's like I was writing down something the other day. It's like Pastor Stanley. I'm like looking at Ben. I'm like, yeah, okay. And when I write my notes for church, I'm tempted to write Pastor Stanley down there, but I know that in the future I'll look at that and I'm like, which Pastor Stanley was that? So, but at any rate, and as I thought about all of this, I thought, one of the most influential things that I had growing up was the fellowship of the other believers. These young people here at that time, and the fellowship that I had with them, and how important that was, for me and to me. And so I think about that even now. I think about how important fellowship is. And we've got a few minutes here to really, if we can, just talk about fellowship. Because, one of the things that, when I think about you two guys, you guys have been friends for how long?
We're friends.
Yeah, we're friends. See, I love that, because that's what fellowship really is about. It's interesting that, because in the midst of all of this, we go to church, but how many people in the church actually have this close fellowship? I mean, when we think about even good churches, and I'd say, we're a good church, but even in this, it's like, how much fellowship do we have? How many people have what you two would have, or what I would have with one or two others in that way? And so I really want to talk about that. I know that when we talk about talk about fellowship, it's like, okay, we can talk about the Lord, we can kind of fellowship with anybody as believers, and that's kind of a general thing. But then there's something that's higher than that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when we think about just fellowship in general, just, okay, let's talk about the Bible, let's get together on a Sunday and everybody's together, we're worshiping together, and maybe get together for dinner or something like that. But how would you describe, each of you, how would you describe the fellowship that you've had over the last couple of years, as opposed to just fellowship in general? Is that a fair question? How would you describe that?
You can go first.
Okay. Well, I would say, in my mind, there is a type of fellowship where I'm trying to fellowship. I'm trying to take an interest in the person. I'm trying to talk about what's going on in my life. I'm trying to talk about the Lord. It's like I'm trying to connect. Like that's my desire. That's my goal. And maybe they are too. But it's a lot of trying, and that's good.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. And intent that way. And then I would say, but then there's fellowship, and we would have this and a few others where it's like I'm not trying to fellowship. I'm not sitting there in general purposing like I need to take an interest in Silas, or I need to be open, or I want to talk a little. I'm not doing that. It's just like when we're together, it's like I can almost talk as freely as my thoughts come and go. And so just as, we can just express our thoughts out loud. And as we do that, it's just like it results in fellowship. And
that is really scary. I mean, when you think about that, I mean, when you hear that, what are your thoughts? I can just, it's like I can just say what I want to say.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I think it's freeing. I think in some sense it can be scary, but and I think it's because we're unified in going towards the Lord together. And we both know that, and there's a sense in which that's the biggest thing to both of us. It's not about who he is or what he struggles with. It's, is he going towards the Lord? And I think we're both unified in that.
When we think about fellowship, most of the time, like when you say we're trying to fellowship, there are times we have to just pull it out of people to talk about the things of Christ. Now, how would you describe your relationship in light of fellowship, in light of talking about the things of Christ? I mean, is it I really got to work at it? Is it two, it's like we can just talk about the things of Christ at a drop of a coin? How would you describe that?
I think, like I was saying, I think it's pretty free. I think that not only can we just feel free to talk about the Lord, but it's like because we feel free to do that, we can feel free to talk about pretty much anything else and not feel like we're taking away from it. So it's just as much as a friendship and a relationship that's grown over time, and you can just be free to do and say whatever it is.
So do you ever come to a point at which it's like, you shouldn't have said that to me? And
I mean, not really. I mean, there's times when something might be said that's not good, but then it's just like, but no, I don't really ever have it where I'm like, sometimes he says that, or sometimes I say I shouldn't have said that to him, but
And now describe that in light of fellowship, because you're not always going to agree on everything. I mean, you're two different individuals. And so if you're expressing everything that's if I expressed everything that was on my mind, I'd be in trouble. And so there is some reserve, in that respect. But when you do express it, we're talking about something that is deeper, that is encouraging, that is sharpening, that is helpful. And so in the midst of that, do you argue?
Not in the definition of
we
argue.
discuss things. No, okay. No, we don't argue, but there would be a sense in which when we talk, it's easy so if he says things to me that are hard to take, because we say things to each other that are hard to take sometimes. And sometimes I ask him to say things that are hard to take to me, just like in the sense of like, just be honest with me. But there is a sense in which I know that he cares for me, and I know he wants to serve the Lord, and he knows that I care for him and I want to serve the Lord. So it's like everything that's said is said in the context of like, I'm not trying to harm you. And so I think what hinders fellowship a lot of times is when somebody's being honest, or they're talking along and the other person feels like they're hurting me, they're harming me, they're saying things that tear me down. And it's kind of like, in my mind, if he says things that tear me down, I'm like, I must need to be torn down, because I probably have a view of myself that's not helpful or accurate, and I take it as such, or I look at myself as such. I'm not really worried about like, is he for me or against me or anything like that. It's like, I know he is. I don't have to worry about it. And
How do you feel? How do you feel about the same things that he's just talking about?
I agree, and there's been certain times where he's said things to me that are hard and pointed, and maybe he even said them out of frustration, but in a good way. And instead of like, how dare you say that about me, I have to like consider it, because I know he cares about me, and I know he wants me to serve the Lord, and I'm convinced of that. So I can't even take it in a way where he's pointing directly at me. I have to take it from the perspective of he loves me.
So now really what you're describing is, if you take that into most of Christianity, where you're trying to fellowship and you just say something pointedly, or something that is that could be offensive, but it's true and that it would be helpful, most people are not going to respond in a good way. I've been around enough, you guys have been around enough that, and I think this is, and I think you're right, this is what hinders that fellowship from happening. So when we think about, here you're thinking about the church now, and you want them to fellowship. I assume that both of you would want other people to have the same type of fellowship that you have. In my experience, there's not a lot of people that have that. There's not a lot of people that can just say what they would say and you not be offended. Just to tell you what the truth is and not be offended. And it's not an easy thing. So what does a person need to do? What would you say? What would you say for believers here, and what would you say for other Christians, that this is what they really need to do in order to come to a place in which they can have this open fellowship that is literally sharpening one another, rather than just a little bit of sharpening here and a little bit there, and and we can kind of get along as Christians, and that's kind of where a lot of it is. We just get along, and we just put up with each other. But we want to go far beyond that, because we're a family. So what would you say, Pastor Ben? You go first.
So I think in terms of, I think to have that with somebody else, you have to genuinely love and care for another person and be interested in them and want them to grow and want them to be benefited and go forward, and have that spirit and attitude towards them and be unguarded in it. And when I say be unguarded, not be offended by things that they would say back. And you have to have that towards them. But then to have that with somebody, it's really two people have to have that towards each other, and you can't force that. You can't make it happen. And I think we want to. We want to go like, well, I completely love somebody and care for them if they would do it back to me. And it's like, well, at that point, it's really about you and not them.
Right.
The only place where it's proven it's for the Lord's glory and about them is when it doesn't come back to you. And then when it does, if the Lord blesses you in that way, because I look at it as the Lord blessing, to give you friendships or relationships that way.
Right.
If he does that, then it's just you just praise him.
We're so much looking for what we might call a soulmate in the Christian life.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come but by way of the Lord in that way, if in fact we would call it that. But the fellowship that you would have one with another is not something that repeats itself often, because it does take the two that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, the both sides of that. That's a huge thing. So what does a person need to do to get to the place in which they say, whatever you say doesn't offend me?
Well, I think it goes just like your relationship with the Lord. If you're pursuing the Lord and you're submitted to the Lord and you want to serve the Lord shows you how He forgives you and how He loves you, and that is what you give to other people. You know, it's not this thing where you systematically figure out how to do it. It's this thing where you have a relationship with the Lord and He shows you this is what it is to love somebody, because this is how I've loved you. And in that, I can go and I'm like, that means it requires sacrifice, it requires patience, it requires these things where now I'm willing and want to do those things because it brings this thing that's good. And I could even say that in the relationship that we had, it's proven that to me. So it almost makes it so it's free for me to go want to do that with other people, because I know it produces something good. And the Lord has used that relationship with Him and the relationship with each other to show me that.
Now, it's one thing for you to be on the receiving end, but when you start giving out your freedom of fellowship, I guess we can call it,
Right.
That's not necessarily taken so well at times.
No.
And so what do you do when it's not taken well? How do you respond? First of all, have you experienced that?
Yeah.
We almost have to experience it, because it's so easy to not say, or to say, it's so easy to say something, it's not easy to hold it back, especially when you want that freedom.
Right. Well, I think it comes, it's the same thing that happened with him and I, where it's like it comes from pursuing the person out of love, pursuing the person out of care, and just continue in that same direction. It's not just, well, I'm already here, and they should be coming to me. It's now I have to pursue that path with them. And any of that, like I was saying, it's going to produce something good. And so even where it's like, I think because I'm in this position of I can say whatever I want freely with him and I can't with somebody else, it still means I need to grow in another area. So I need to go to the Lord and, Lord, help me to go towards this person in the right way, and that's loving towards them and caring towards them so that they see that I love them from you and not of myself. And so I think it just takes the same effort I did to have a relationship with the Lord in Him.
Do you ever get to a point at which you're afraid that you might say something too much to each other?
You know?
I mean, that you would be too open, and you wonder if the other person might just get offended by that?
I'm more afraid that he wouldn't like me. I'm kidding. But I mean, like I don't think there's a sense of fear in anything. I think that we're just beyond that. In my mind, anyway. Like I there's been a certain amount of openness where it just had to have been the Lord, and I don't think it doesn't make sense to go backwards. You know, it just only can go forward in the freedom that we have.
Right. So how would you encourage others today to say, okay, look, here's where you want to start, and here's where you want to progress to? Because the relationship that you have, that has to be of the Lord. I mean, you just, as you said, you know, you can go out and do that, but it has to be reciprocated, and that's just hard to come by. Mm-hmm. So what does a person do in the meantime in light of just, because I would look at, there's a number of different levels to fellowship. You know, there's just that basic, you're going to church and you could just kind of around those things, but then you're interacting with other Christians. talking about things. You're going to Bible studies. You're there with other believers, but you haven't yet got to this place. So, what for the person who says, okay, I really don't fellowship a lot. What do I need to do? What are some of the key things that I could just start out today that will encourage me to be the fellowshipper that I need to be? So I know you talked about a couple of things, but now come back to the basic, saying, okay, here's some things that we just need to do that would encourage it all.
Well, maybe it depends on where you're at. I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but one thing that comes to my mind, because I think of, when you describe it that way, I think of somebody that is either a younger believer or hasn't matured as much in the Word in some ways. And I tend to go, I would say, there are, generally speaking, in any church or any group of people, those that are older and more mature in the faith that fellowship easy and know how to take an interest in you and kind of cultivate fellowship. And I think a lot of times it's like we can kind of tend to stay in our own group, and it's like none of us really fellowship well, and it's kind of like, well, go find somebody that does. Or I love in 1 John when he says, these things have we written unto you, and he talks about how so that we could have fellowship together. And he just tells them, right in the beginning of that book, he's like, just so you know, I'm writing this to you because I want to have fellowship with you. It's like, well, do that with somebody. Just go, hey, I'd like to get to know you so we could fellowship around the Lord and have, because otherwise it's like, I think so many times we just spend so much time beating around the bush. We're like, how do I work in fellowship and grow in this, but I don't look like I'm trying. And it's just like, well, look like you're trying. That's okay.
Right, that's good. That's good. Silas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think when if I don't want a fellowship, then I think there's something wrong with my relationship with the Lord. So I would first, be going, what is it why don't I want a fellowship? And start there. And then like when I was saying, just go towards people want to fellowship, and go towards people you see as people who want to go towards the Lord.
Now, in your experience, have you found people that don't want a fellowship?
Yeah.
And so when you think about them, you're thinking it's not about the fact they don't want a fellowship. It goes a lot deeper.
Right.
And so what is it that you would encourage that one to do? I mean, if somebody is listening today and they're saying, you know what, I like listening to you guys talk, but I don't want to talk to anybody else. I don't want to get in and have this. I don't want to have this going on in my life. They just don't want to talk about those things. So what would you tell them?
Well, I'd first ask them why not, because it's great and it's awesome, and you grow a lot in the Lord together, which is it's a beautiful thing. And, well, I would say,
and it's a biblical principle,
right,
and command.
Yeah.
So,
well, again, this is me personally. I would again say, I think you should really see where your heart's at with the Lord, because why wouldn't you want to grow with the believers and talk about the one that saved you and what he's doing in your life and how he's helping you grow, and then if you don't want to talk about those things, are they actually happening? I mean, how can you be saved from death and from sin, and you're on your way to spend your life with the Lord, and you not want to talk about how you're growing in the understanding or having hope in that? So I would just be like, you have to really look at where you're at with the Lord, because it's not necessarily fellowship that's the problem. Your problem, again, is your desire to follow Christ and be submitted to the Lord and live your life for him.
And it's interesting, as you're talking, I can feel the freedom that you have in just saying what you're saying, and that's what the fellowship really is. It's and if you're talking to somebody that way and they're not receiving it, it's not because you're not being open and caring for their soul. It's not because you don't want to have fellowship with them. It's not because you're looking at them saying, you know what, I'm just going to be as hard as I can on you, so you just get right, and I'm going to go off and live so I don't have to be bothered with your nonsense anymore. It's, hey, this is what the truth is. And that's part of the fellowship that we're talking about, and just being open with each other in that way.
Right. Well, and again, I don't think the person in that position, I don't believe I'm there with them. So I'm not sitting there saying, hey, you are not right with the Lord. It's more like I can see that, and I go towards them knowing that, and then help them and encourage them and exhort them to go towards the Lord so that they can have that freedom or that encouragement or that life to want fellowship around the Lord.
With so many different levels of fellowship, we really want to have the greatest amount that we can. We have such short lives and a short time to serve the Lord, and we really want to be sharpened the best that we can. And what is it that I have a few things in my mind that gets in the way of fellowship? What comes to your mind off the top of your head when you say this is what hinders good, honest fellowship? Anything come to either of your minds?
I mean, yeah, and I was thinking it's kind of similar to what you were asking him as far as why wouldn't a person want a fellowship? What hinders it? And I tend to go sin. Sin hinders it. But it's not.
So how does sin hinder fellowship?
But not. I was gonna say. So it's not just sin. It's the hiding of sin that hinders it.
Okay.
And I think that's why a person doesn't want a fellowship. And anybody that doesn't want to have a close connection with people, it's because they're trying to hide sin. So that's why we don't come to the light, because our deeds are evil. But I would say in that we all wrestle deeply with that. There's a lot of times where it's like, I don't want to come to the light because I'm sinful and I'm afraid maybe somebody will point that out. But really, my fear is not, I can blame that on them and go, well, I don't express and I'm not open because maybe they'll be hard or judgmental towards me. It's like, that's not the reason why. The reason why is I want to appear righteous.
Or I want to continue in my sin.
Either way.
Right.
One or the other. But it's like that hiding of sin. And at the same time, it's like, there's just nothing more edifying and beneficial to have a relationship with somebody where you can be open about sin and you're wrestling and struggling in it and your desire to grow in it and you can fellowship around that and encourage each other. There's just nothing better than that.
Now somebody's listening, they're going, hey, I'm glad you guys can do that, but if I said what's on my heart and what's on my mind and what I've done to anybody, then I'm going to be ostracized and I'm not going to be, there's no hope for me anymore in that church. They just won't even want me anymore. So,
and I would say there is no temptation that's taken you, but such as is common to man.
Right.
And so we all feel that. Every person feels that in their soul. And yet, every person completely, for the most part, if they were honest, would go, I understand that. I've felt the same thing. I've done the same thing. I've thought the same thing. I've been in the same place. Maybe I am in the same place.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because believers in the church is supposed to be the place where we all recognize that we're all sinful and have fallen far short of the glory of God, and now we're here to grow and serve Him. And yet, that can sometimes become the place where we feel like we have to conceal that the most, which is the exact opposite of what it's about.
That is funny that way, isn't it?
Well, and there's been a number of times, maybe 100 or 500 times, where it's like Benaiah and I can have a fellowship with each other, and then I'll hide my sin, or I'll be struggling with something, and I'll just been like, I don't want to deal with it or talk about it, or he's just going to think I'm weak or pathetic, and I fell into this sin again, and it's just going over and over, and it's like you can feel the wall being built, like everything kind of slows down, things are quiet, nothing's happening, and it's just because I'm afraid that he's going to judge me or whatever, and then I'll just be like, this is what's going on in my life. And just like that, there's just a freedom that comes, and that's doing that over and over again is what creates that sense of like, I know He cares about me, because I was able to tell Him this is what's going on, and instead of judging or putting some sort of anger towards it, there's a care and a sense of like, well, what can I do to help, or this is what you can do, and then we talk it through like we're friends. And not like like he's my pastor and I'm part of the church.
It is kind of a different relationship, of course, now that you've been pastoring for how long? Like 5 years? Like
5 weeks.
A couple of months, something that way. Well,
Feels like
we'll
5
hook up
years.
on that another time here too. But well, I really appreciate you guys taking time to talk about that. Of course, I was so glad that you're with me tonight. And
Yeah, I did want to say it's really cool about your testimony as far as like the grace that the Lord had on you just by the faithfulness and the repetitiveness of people just asking the question, "Are you a Christian?" And it's like just the question is what brought the conviction. It's not like you had to go and get this deep depth of the gospel or someone preaching at you or some traumatic event. It's like the Lord used just a simple question to convict you, and I think that's great and that's awesome.
Yeah, and of course I always have a place in my heart for that man. He's gone on to be with the Lord now. In fact, I found out afterwards that his wife prayed for me every day that I would be saved, and so she has a special place in my heart too. And so anyway, the whole family. I still have contact with the family that way, and so it's
That's really cool.
so blessing that way. Well, we're going to finish up here tonight. Next week we're going to be sitting around this table. We're going to be, you and I will be interviewing a fellow who has done some evangelistic work. He's been a pastor, and we're going to be talking about evangelism as well as hearing his testimony. And hopefully we can get his wife here too and hear them. And then, of course, 2 weeks from today, I'm excited about that. We're going to be talking with a policeman and hearing his testimony. So yeah, we got to hide everything then. But that'll be good. It'll be good. So we'll look forward to that. Well, listen, we thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Appreciate you taking time to listen to the testimony, listen to the conversation. God has been so good to us. We rejoice. We love fellowship. We love the Lord, love the Word, and that is our desire, and that is hope even for you, that you might come to know the Lord as well, and that you might enjoy Him in all His entirety, all that He wants for us to have in this lifetime, looking forward to the next. This life is but a moment. It appears for just a moment, then it's gone. And so we need to live for the Lord as much as we possibly can and drive forward in that way, pressing towards that mark of the high calling of Christ. And so we appreciate you being with us tonight. If you're up early tomorrow, feel free to join me 6:40 in the morning as we finish up this week, as we look at looking at the cross. And we've looked at 5 different avenues of the cross. And tomorrow we'll finish up as we look at the power of the cross. And so join me then. Until then, you have a great night. Appreciate your being with us.